September 12, 1945. Singapore stood on the edge of history. Crowds gathered outside City Hall, sensing that a moment years in the making was finally about to unfold. Few could imagine how dramatically fortunes had changed since the darkest days of the war. Just 3 years earlier, Singapore had lived under Japanese occupation. Streets that once reflected British authority were now controlled by Japanese military forces. Daily life became uncertain, and fear was never far away for many civilians. Before Singapore fell, British commanders believed the island fortress could withstand almost any attack. Military planners considered it one of the strongest defensive positions in the British Empire, protected by troops, artillery, and strategic planning. But Japan launched a lightning campaign through Malaya. Moving with speed and determination, Japanese forces advanced southward through difficult terrain, surprising Allied commanders and steadily pushing British defenses back toward Singapore. As Japanese troops approached, British soldiers prepared defensive positions around the island. They knew the battle ahead could determine the future of Southeast Asia, yet the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Heavy fighting erupted across Singapore. Explosions echoed through the city as British, Australian, and Indian troops attempted to stop the Japanese advance. Despite fierce resistance, Japanese forces continued gaining ground. Soon the scale of the disaster became impossible to ignore. British troops were forced to withdraw, supplies were running low, and defensive lines were collapsing under relentless pressure from the advancing Japanese army. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival faced an agonizing decision. Continuing the battle could lead to even greater loss of life. Yet surrendering Singapore would become one of the greatest defeats in British military history. Across the negotiating table sat General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Confident and determined, the Japanese commander understood that victory was within reach and that the British position had become nearly hopeless. On February 15, 1942, the unthinkable happened. Britain formally surrendered Singapore. The event shocked the world and shattered the image of British invincibility throughout Asia and beyond. Thousands of Allied soldiers marched into captivity. For many, years of hardship, forced labor, disease, and uncertainty lay ahead. The surrender changed countless lives forever. Prisoners of war endured extremely difficult conditions. Many faced hunger, exhaustion, and brutal treatment while waiting for a conflict that seemed to have no end. In London, the news reached British leaders. The fall of Singapore was viewed as a national catastrophe. Winston Churchill would later describe it as one of Britain's worst military disasters. Meanwhile, Japanese forces celebrated their victory. Singapore became a symbol of Japan's expanding empire and one of the most significant achievements of its wartime campaign. Yet wars can change quickly. As the conflict continued, Japan began losing the momentum that had fueled its early victories. Across the Pacific, Allied forces started pushing back. In Burma, British and Commonwealth troops fought hard to regain lost territory. Successful campaigns weakened Japanese positions and demonstrated that the tide of war was beginning to turn. Inside Japanese headquarters, military leaders studied increasingly troubling reports. Resources were shrinking, battlefronts were collapsing, and victory no longer seemed possible. Japanese cities suffered extensive destruction from bombing campaigns. The war was bringing devastation closer to home, and the pressure on Japan's government continued to grow. Then came August 1945. Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. After years of warfare and unimaginable destruction, the conflict that had engulfed Asia and the Pacific was finally ending. News spread rapidly throughout Singapore. Civilians who had endured occupation for more than 3 years began realizing that liberation was finally approaching. Soon Allied warships appeared near Singapore. Massive naval forces returned to waters once dominated by Japan, signaling that a historic reversal was underway. Among those arriving was Lord Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander of Southeast Asia. He carried the responsibility of accepting Japan's surrender and restoring Allied authority. Along the waterfront, civilians gathered to witness the arrival of Allied forces. Many had waited years for this moment and watched with a mixture of relief, hope, and excitement. Allied troops disembarked and moved into the city. Their presence confirmed that Japanese rule was ending and that a new chapter was beginning for Singapore. Preparations soon began inside Singapore City Hall. Tables were arranged, documents prepared, and officials assembled for a ceremony that would become one of the most significant events of the war. Journalists and photographers filled the building. Cameras were readied because everyone understood they were about to witness a moment that would be recorded for history. The Japanese delegation arrived at City Hall. Senior officers entered in formal military uniforms, fully aware that they were participating in the final chapter of Japan's wartime empire. Leading the delegation was General Seishiro Itagaki. Once a commander of powerful Japanese forces, he now faced the difficult responsibility of formally acknowledging defeat. Allied officers carefully observed the arrival of the Japanese representatives. The atmosphere inside the building was serious, disciplined, and filled with historical significance. Representatives from both sides took their seats. The same city that had witnessed Britain's humiliation in 1942 was now preparing to witness Japan's surrender in 1945. On the table rested the surrender document. It appeared simple, yet it carried enormous weight. The signatures placed upon it would officially end Japanese authority in Southeast Asia. General Itagaki sat quietly before the document. Around him, military officers, photographers, and officials waited in near silence for the ceremony's defining moment. For many Japanese officers, surrender remained difficult to accept. Military culture had long emphasized honor and sacrifice, making this moment especially painful for those present. Then the crucial moment arrived. General Itagaki reached for the pen and signed the surrender document, formally acknowledging Japan's defeat before the Allied representatives. Afterward, Lord Mountbatten signed on behalf of the Allies. With those signatures, Japanese control across Southeast Asia officially came to an end. The ceremony itself lasted only a short time, yet its meaning was immense. Years of conflict, occupation, suffering, and sacrifice had led to this single historic moment. Outside, celebrations erupted across Singapore. Civilians filled the streets, cheering and waving flags as news spread that Japanese occupation had officially ended. Former prisoners of war and liberated civilians experienced powerful emotions. For many, freedom had finally returned after years marked by hardship and uncertainty. British troops marched through Singapore once again. The sight represented far more than military success. It symbolized recovery from one of Britain's greatest wartime defeats. As the day ended, Singapore City Hall stood as a symbol of history coming full circle. In 1942, Britain had surrendered here in defeat. In 1945, Japan surrendered in the same city. The war in Southeast Asia was over, the occupation had ended, and one of World War II's most remarkable reversals was complete.